सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and this time we're going to be discussing how up till just a little while ago, for 3 months we saw inflation easing, things were looking better, prices were coming down, but suddenly the latest data came in November and it seems to have again gone up quite sharply. Why is this? What is driving this inflation? Is there any solution to this mess? That's what we're going to discuss in this episode, and for that we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us.
Sharad.
So now, Radhika, right at the outset, could you tell us a little bit about what the number was, the inflation number was in November, and how different was it from what was happening in the preceding 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, so if we look at the trajectory of inflation measured by consumer price index, we saw that it peaked in July. July was the highest at 7.44%.
Right.
And since July, we were seeing a declining trend in inflation. It came down to 6.8 in August, then it came down further to around 6, then came down further. So for 3 months, we were seeing a declining trend in CPI inflation. And in October, encouragingly, we saw CPI inflation at 4.87%.
Below even 5.
Below even 5. So, but in November, we have again seen a resurgence in inflation. It has come in at 5.55%. And if we just look at rural and urban inflation, rural inflation is much higher at 5.85%. So, we have seen a resurgence in inflation in November, and more so for rural regions as compared to the urban ones.
So now that you mentioned rural inflation, I guess we can jump into an audience question that has to do with the same issue. So Gautam asks, what is the fundamental reason behind a higher headline inflation in the rural areas than in urban areas?
See, the fundamental reason is that whenever inflation is driven by food inflation,
Right.
we will intuitively see that rural inflation surpasses urban inflation, and that has to do with the weights, because we know that CPI is a price index of a basket of goods,
Right.
and that basket is based on consumption pattern, and we know that this is based on consumption expenditure survey, which where the rural regions give higher weight to food. So whenever we see that there is a food inflation, then the rural inflation tends to be higher than urban inflation,
Right.
because in rural regions the weightage given to food is much higher. So whenever prices rise, the overall inflation, which is a combination of the weights as well as the prices, it will be higher for rural regions. So just in terms of numbers, the weight for food in rural regions is above 40. It's almost 46-47%. Whereas
Of the entire basket?
of the entire basket,
Wow.
and in urban it is 29%.
Okay.
So that explains the deviation or the divergence between rural and urban inflation. So it's quite intuitive that because of the weights, whenever food inflation rises, we always see that rural inflation is more than urban inflation, and that is what we have been seeing for the last 3 months, where food inflation had been the key driver.
Right. And now from what you're saying, it's clear that food inflation this time has been the driver of
Yes.
of
Yeah.
overall inflation. So could you
Yes.
tell us a little more about those numbers?
Sure. So food inflation came in at 8.7%.
Wow.
And if we look at all the broad components, we look at fruits, we look at vegetables, we look at spices, we look at cereals, we look at pulses. All these 5 broad categories of food inflation experienced double-digit inflation. Okay,
Wow.
so vegetables inflation saw a growth of 17.7%. pulses inflation more than 20%, cereals inflation more than 10%, and this time around even fruit inflation has rebounded, because fruit inflation used to be somewhere around 8 to 9%. It also went into the double-digit growth territory in November. So it's mainly due to food inflation that we are seeing that overall inflation has rebounded. It has reversed its trend of decline that we saw in the previous 3 months.
Right. So why is this? Why is it that food inflation is remaining sticky and high?
Yeah, so one reason is definitely the production problem. We have seen that the uncertain rainfall and the uneven rainfall have caused havoc with the food production. We have seen cereals, especially if you look at the first advance estimate, we saw that food output is going to be lower. The food grain output, the kharif output is going to be lower in this cropping season as compared to the previous year. So it is due to that reason, and plus there are seasonal factors at play. Also, that leads to particularly rise in vegetable prices. So we should expect a moderation in vegetable prices from January onwards, even from December onwards, especially like, for example, what we saw in November. Vegetable prices were primarily driven by onion inflation, which was more than 40%. Onion inflation was more than 40%. Tomato prices still continue to remain elevated. Garlic prices have rebounded. So that is one reason that, one is that there is a pressure on production due to low soil moisture, due to uneven rainfall, due to unfavorable weather conditions, El Nino effect taking to, and that is what we saw in the agricultural GVA also, that it moderated, and it's expected to moderate even further in the October-December quarter. So all these things have led to rise in food inflation, and also there is a seasonal factor at play, and that primarily impacts vegetable production and vegetable prices.
But if you say seasonal factor, then you're comparing November of this year to November of last year. It should be the same seasonal factors that affected November last year as this year. So why is there double-digit growth?
No, so when we compare November of 2023 with November of 2022, there is a base effect at play. Seasonal factors come into play when you are talking about a single year, okay? Because there are these seasonal spikes that happen regularly in a year.
In a single year.
In a single year. So, a very important reason also for the resurgence in inflation in November was the unfavorable base effect. What we saw in November of 2022 was that the index number, because CPI is an index number, it was lower. So, it was lower than October 2022. So the base is lower, and when we are calculating the growth rate, where we are subtracting November 2022 from November 2023,
then of course
the difference will be more, and therefore it will show up as a higher inflation. So there is, when we do this year-on-year growth rate, which is normally what we look at, there is always this problem of unfavorable base effect playing in certain months, and it is expected that in December it will even be more unfavorable as compared to November. So December inflation is going to be higher, particularly primarily due to the base effect. So that reason is there. So to address this problem of base effect, the other alternative way is to look at month-on-month growth. What happened in November over October. Not comparing November with November of last year, but comparing November with the previous month.
And that's largely also what people care about. They don't really remember what the case was last year, right? They want to know, are things going to get better? Are things right now better than they were last month?
Absolutely. So that gives a more timely signal. It gives a more, you can always rely on these signals for effective policy responses also. So along with year-on-year change, it's also prudent to look at month-on-month change. But when we look at month-on-month change, we need to remove the seasonality. We need to remove the seasonal fluctuation that may come up in certain months and may obscure the actual trends, actual changes. So to address that, so we remove seasonality. There are a number of seasonal adjustment procedures, very standard seasonal adjustment procedures. And in fact, in other countries, if you look at the US, their statistical agencies provide seasonally adjusted data. Here we
I
don't
see.
get, our CSO does not provide seasonally adjusted data, but if you look at the US, the GDP numbers that come out, they are all seasonally adjusted. They are quarter on quarter growth numbers and they are seasonally adjusted.
Right.
So, but it's very easy. I mean, we can do ourselves also, and once we adjust for seasonality, what we see is, what we are now looking at is the momentum in inflation. What is the sequential increase from October to November? Has it moderated as compared to from September to October or not?
Right.
And we see that it hasn't moderated. In fact, it has increased. So there is
I
a 0.7% increase in food inflation from October to November. And if we look at rural and urban separately, in fact, there is even more. It's almost 1% increase in food price index from October to November. So this means that it is the food inflation which is driving, and from October to November also the index numbers in a span of 1 month, it has increased by 1%, which is quite a solid growth in a span of 1 month because it is an index number.
Right.
And it's mainly driven by vegetable prices, where the month-on-month growth is 5%. So it's a very high number. So this is what we get, so it's always useful to look at the year-on-year change as well as the month-on-month change. And in both the cases, we understand that it is the food inflation which is the driving force, but year-on-year change is sometimes confounded by the base factor.
The base effect,
so to address that, it is also useful to look at the month-on-month change after adjusting for seasonal fluctuations.
Right. Okay. So now we know that food inflation is higher than it was last year, and we also know that within this year food inflation has been kind of accelerating.
Yes.
Prices have been going up at a faster rate. Now Sankalp actually asks this question. He says that now we know that the farm laws are kind of dead. So what outside of the farm laws can we do to solve this problem? And I would add to that question, which is, would cold chains help? Would better storage help? Would maybe forward contracts help, where you say that, I will buy your produce a year from now at a set price? Will that help?
Yeah, definitely. All these are very important for the purposes of stabilizing the prices, because the main problem is that there is a sharp volatility in food prices, and this we see every year, that there are intra-year sharp swings in food prices. Tomato prices, they skyrocket, and again there is a sharp decline in prices which affect farmers. So to protect farmers' income also and to protect their interest is always useful to, it will balance the interests of consumers as well as farmers. Otherwise, what we do then is to adopt these knee-jerk reactions that we are doing right now, which is imposing export bans on onions, which is again it's not very helpful for farmers. Then they protest, and it also doesn't help our image in the international market.
Right.
It gives a very unfavorable impression about the production prospects and the prices, and it further could encourage hoarding. So it is always better to focus and to have more investments in agri storage, in logistics, in transportation, in cold storage, in ensuring that there is greater interaction between the private participants and farmers, so that they can enter into these long-term contracts for procurement. So other than the FCI, if we allow private participants also to procure from farmers, it will help in stabilization. And it's always it's necessary to invest on agri infrastructure. But I would add to this that this time around it's not the same problem as we saw say 2 years back, because there is always this sharp swing, but this time around the problem is more about the decline in production due to unfavorable weather conditions. So farmers need to have the produce to enter into these contracts.
It's not the supply chain as much as the supply itself.
It's supply itself. Yeah, that is important. So it's important to diagnose the problem that this time around it's due to decline in production and output, in addition to the regular volatility and upswings and downswings that we see in prices. So that is important.
Right. So Sankalp has another question that you also touched upon. He says that in the West, in the US, supermarket chains often have long-term contracts with farmers. So he's asking, can something like that be implemented here, where you either have private players having these long-term contracts, or you have government agencies having longer-term contracts?
So I think that was the essence of the farm laws, because farm laws did provide, try to provide that kind of a framework, and since those are dead, so outside of the farm laws, whatever can be done, I think we talked about this, that this is one of the remedy to ensure
Correct.
stable prices for farmers as well as for consumers, in addition to investment in agri infrastructure.
Right. And Gautam also had another question. Now, this is drilling down from the countrywide data to the states.
Yeah.
He asks, why do Rajasthan, Haryana, and Odisha again have
Yeah.
such high inflation? And is there something that the RBI can do that can target inflation in particular states?
Yeah, so before we jump into this question, if we look at the November state inflation data, which we've looked at, so what we see is that, tallying with this question, it shows that now there are more number of states we see whose inflation has crossed the 5% mark,
Right.
as compared to October. So in October, there were 11 states where inflation was more than 5%. This time, there are 18 states whose inflation is more than 5%. And there are more than 10 states whose inflation is above the all India average. And there are some states, like we spoke about last month also, Rajasthan, Odisha. These are states which have this perennial problem of high inflation. But this time in November, what we have seen, interestingly, is that those states which were till now having quite moderate level of inflation, there has been a steep jump in inflation. So particularly Punjab and Gujarat.
Right.
Gujarat's inflation was 5.25 or 5.3% in October. It's now jumped to more than 1% in November. Same is the case.
Jumped by more than 1%.
Jumped by more than
Wow.
1% in a month. Same is the case with Punjab. So we have seen quite a number of states where there has been a steep jump from October to November. And again, the problem has to do with food inflation.
Right.
The problem has to do with unfavorable base effect. And in most of these states that we are talking about Haryana, especially there, if we look at the data, there is a sharp difference between urban and rural inflation. Rural inflation is more than 3% higher than urban inflation.
Wow.
So that shows the impact of food.
Right.
Because
And the weights.
And their weights.
Yeah.
That, when the food inflation is higher and rural population is assigning higher weights to food in their consumption basket, even a slight change in prices could amplify the impact on the overall inflation. And that is what we are seeing, that out of these states that we've talked about, Rajasthan, Odisha, Haryana, Rajasthan and Haryana, rural inflation is much higher than urban inflation. The difference is quite stark, and that has to do with the higher food inflation. In Punjab, especially, what we see is that, because it's a producer of cereal inflation is subdued, but pulses inflation is very high. It's more than 20%. So pulses is a problem, and we are in the process of importing pulses.
Right.
And also what we see in the daily data, because now we can also look at the Department of Consumer Affairs releases daily data.
Yes.
And we have this data for 11 days of December. We don't see any signs of moderation, at least in pulses prices and cereal prices in December. So what we expect is that food inflation is likely to remain elevated in December also.
Right.
Even though there are some signs of deceleration in potato, onion and tomato prices, but that would be more than offset by cereal and pulses prices.
Wow, that's not great news. But yes, so coming back to his question, is there something the RBI can do to particularly target states?
So RBI looks at the all India inflation only, and RBI's mandate is to only look at that. Plus, what happens in some of the other countries, the composition of the Monetary Policy Committee is such that they also take into account the local or regional problems, local or regional specific factors that could have impacted inflation. But that is not the case in India's MPC, maybe in the next round of amendment, or what could be done to further streamline or strengthen the MPC.
Right.
One addition or one improvement could be to do something to bring about regional or local perspective. That is not something currently that we see. If you look at the MPC's, the Monetary Policy Committee statements also, there is never a mention of local or regional specific factors. They are only
Right.
looking at all India level. They are looking at the broad categories and the drivers, but not something particularly touching maybe a particular state. And that is very important. So I can just give you one example. If you just look at Northeast states, Manipur and Mizoram, they are quite close. But if you look at their inflation, in Manipur, inflation is more than 11%. And in Mizoram, it is 3.5%.
And that could be because of the violence in Manipur.
Yeah, so there are these various factors that could have led to a spike in inflation, and in states which are quite close to each other, neighboring states also, we see stark divergence, and these are all here. The local factors are at play,
Right.
in addition to the weights and other, the price collection centers, or maybe there would be transportation bottlenecks and so on.
Right. So absolutely, local issues are very, very important to look at. So, but on that note, that's what we have. Inflation overall again seems to be moving up, and it's driven by food inflation. In November, it went up by quite a lot. In December, it's likely again to move up quite a bit, aided by a poor base effect, but also because food inflation seems to still be trending upwards, or at least not trending downwards. There are a lot of things that can be done in the medium term to fix this, to do with cold chains, to increase storage. You can try to experiment with forward contracts. The farm laws had several provisions that might have helped here, but they didn't come about. But so far, inflation is going to move up. That's what we know so far. On that note, thank you so much for watching.